Hello, everyone. Once again, it's another day of fresh grace and mercy. This is the Guilt, Grace, Gratitude podcast where we bridge the gap to Reformed Christian theology for your listening pleasure. Today, we have a book club special episode with Dr. Gregory Lanier, and we're going to be talking about one of his brand new books. It's published by Hendrickson Publishers. It's Corpus Christologicum.
Almost.
I'm going to pause that.
Yeah, if you want to do that one, so pause and then do it again.
Do the whole thing again.
It's like 15 seconds. Do the whole thing. I'll pause it and then so I know where to break it.
Okay. Today we have Dr. Gregory Lanier on, and he's going to be talking about his new book published by Hendrickson. It's on Corpus Christologicum, Texts and Translations for the Study of Jewish Messianism and Early. I can't say it. Maybe you just do this one.
You want me to do this? Yeah, I'll do this one.
I can't do it.
It just rolls off the tongue. I know.
Oh man, I'm obviously a layperson. I can't do it.
Why don't you? Yeah, you do. I'll do just this part. We'll keep your intro. Okay, I'll pause and then we'll go. So today we have Dr. Gregory Lanier. He's the associate professor of New Testament at RTS Orlando, so Reformed Theological Seminary Orlando. It's a special book club on his new published book from Hendrickson Publishers, Corpus Christologicum, Texts and Translations for the Study of Jewish Messianism and Early Christology. So a mouthful. And it's a little bit more on the scholarly side, but we think that those who are more educated laymen, those who are really interested in kind of first and second century, how did some of these apostles think about Jesus in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and what convinced them that Jesus was the Son of God, and to worship him in the same respect that they worship God the Father. And so you guys have these links in our show notes. We have the NAPARC link. So if you guys are looking for a solid Reformed church after listening to this podcast or want a gospel-centered church on a week-to-week basis, go click that link and it'll show you some different Reformed churches in your area. Also, a link to Society of Reformed Podcasters, where you will find like-minded podcasters like us talking about gospel-centered content. But like I said, we have Dr. Gregory Lanier of RTS Orlando to talk about this special episode of Book Club. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, what he wants this project to do, and who he's written this for. So thanks for coming on again, Dr. Lanier.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And thank you, Peter, for helping me out with the mouthful there. I didn't butcher some words.
It does roll off the tongue. I know.
Yeah,
I'm very proud of the title.
No, it's all good. That's the only reason why I have a seminary education, so that I can say text like this.
Yeah.
So my layman question here would be, what does that title mean? Can you maybe explain that? Break it down.
How to translate. So we need a text and translation of the title of a book that has text and translation in it. I mean, even the title itself sort of gives away that this isn't necessarily, a HarperCollins beach read, if you will. But so the Latin words, and now I have multiple books now with unpronounceable titles. That's probably a problem. But, the first word, corpus, is just corpus, a collection or a group of writings, and then Christologicum is just a fancy word for Christological, or you could even say messianic. So it's basically a collection of writings that scholars find really important for understanding early church Christology. And so what is Christology? Christology is how we understand the person and work of Jesus. The subtitle, it says Texts and Translations, and that tells you essentially what is the bread and butter of the book. And so what I give you are the text of a whole bunch, roughly 300, and mostly intertestamental. So what that fancy word means is writings that are mostly from a Jewish perspective that were composed between the closing of the Old Testament and the writing of the New Testament, which is something like 400 to 500 year period. during which a lot of folks think, oh, it was the silent period. It's not actually true. Lots of things were happening in that period of time, globally and within the Jewish world. A lot of things are being written. A lot of speculation about a Messiah coming or some sort of return of God who's going to save us. And so a lot of things are being written in that time period. So this is a collection of, or a curated collection of those writings. And then, so it's Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek and Latin and a bunch of other languages. And so I give an English translation of that. And the whole reason for a book like this, I'm not arguing a thesis. This is sort of the starting point for someone who would want to go and try to argue a thesis or an argument. The point is to make it accessible and to help people who want to study, what were Jews expecting of a Messiah? And, how did they come to the conclusion that Jesus was the Messiah? You have that in John 1. You also have it in Peter's confession. Jesus, it's a very relevant question, even for Jesus. Jesus comes to his disciples and says, all right, what are people saying that I am, right?
Yeah,
what's the word on the street about me? And what's interesting is that when you read the Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they all have that. They're like, well, some people say this, and some people say that, and some people say, oh, you're Elijah, come back, or maybe you're John the Baptist back from the dead because he had his head chopped off. I don't know why they thought that. That was weird. That very thought process is actually, in some respects, the starting point of a book like this. Why did the Jewish crowds in Galilee, Judea, wherever, why did they have these different ideas? Where would they have gotten those ideas? And so this book is sort of giving you a way to start answering that. So it's a selection of both Old Testament passages, but a lot of Jewish writings prior to the New Testament that Jewish people would have been reading, just like we read, C.S. Lewis or whatever. And so I'm not trying to say, these are like given by God, but it does show you sort of how they were thinking, what ideas were they kicking around as to, okay, is Elijah coming back or not? And are we going to have a king from the line of David come back and kick some Roman butt or not? And so this is a compendium of those kinds of writings that help a modern Christian understand some of the intellectual background of the New Testament so that they can understand it better. So that's in defining that, I guess choosing a title is an art, and I wasn't being very artistic. So if you have to use 7 minutes to explain the title, you've probably done it wrong. But that's the explanation of the title.
Gotcha.
And that gives you an insight as to what the book is about.
I heard the title is a wrestling match between the publisher's editors and the author himself.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is, this was the title I pitched, and it never was changed. But it's a different audience.
Yeah, so, totally. Yeah.
It's not a.
Yeah. And you've talked about this in one of our recent episodes on covenant theology in the Johannine epistles and Revelation, that this has, I think, some stuff that is very relevant for scholars, those who know these languages. But I think you also talk about how this could also be helpful for kind of educated laymen based off the English translation and some of the commentary. So can you describe how can people use this well? How can people use your book on these texts well?
Yeah. I think I joked on that podcast that my wife asked me, will I be able to read this book? And I said, yeah, you'll be able to read half of it. We'll take that. Yeah, I think it's a very relevant question. Is this just something for like PhD students, or could your average churchgoer make any sense of this? One thing that's been interesting to me over really sort of being involved in the church and being involved in the seminary is, as you have things like the Dead Sea Scrolls make the news. Yeah. Just a few weeks ago, another Dead Sea Scroll was found, made the news. Or even, sadly, like some of the shenanigans at the Museum of the Bible, and accusations of forgeries and thefts and so forth. And then when you add your annual like Newsweek article by Kurt Eichenwald trying to blow up Christianity again, why Jesus didn't exist, or whatever, as one example. One of the things I've noticed is that a lot more lay people, certainly more than when I was younger, are asking questions about the background of the New Testament. In fact, I was asked this yesterday. What book would you recommend to help me get up to speed on what happened in between ancient Israel and when Jesus sets foot in the hills of Galilee? And I think that's really encouraging, actually, that lay people are realizing, wait a second, for me to understand the document of the New Testament, I need to understand its cultural background. Just like if I want to try to understand the Declaration of Independence, or I don't know, a biography of Steve Jobs, Jobs, I need to understand what's going on in that time period. And so for a layperson, this book, even though it's long and does have a technical component to it, what it gives you is a little glimpse into what were your average Jews thinking about, praying, hoping for, as they're basically sort of stuck in exile for like 400 something years, after the kind of botched reconstruction of the temple, and things just sort of didn't kind of fizzle out. By the time you get to Malachi, things are not looking so hot. And so that's sort of the broader context. Like, it's people, I think more lay people are realizing that I want to know something about the history prior to the New Testament. It's a big time frame. And so if I had to pick, like, okay, what topic is of most interest to someone who wants to get up the curve on understanding the ins and outs of the historical background, I probably couldn't pick a better one than Christ, right? I mean, there's social stuff, and there's all kinds of interesting things about like the economy of the first century and all that. Like, all that stuff's really interesting. But I had to pick one to focus on. It would be this one, which is, to what degree did people have the sort of a job description in mind for a Messiah, and where do we see that? And what was that like? And to what degree did Jesus sort of check those boxes or not? Because that whenever you have people who are like shouting Hosanna to the Son of David, or when people are questioning him about this or that in the Gospels, there's actually a background to that. It's not just in a vacuum. To make any sense of the questions they're asking, you have to know sort of the lay of the land. And so that's what this book could help someone do, and get a feel for it. So
yeah,
that'd be the hope, at least.
As a theologically interested layman myself, you sold me. I mean, I'll try not to pronounce the title of the book, and I'll just jump in and start reading it. And I think what you're explaining is really cool. It allowed me to maybe start thinking, if I put myself in the shoes of the people back then before Christ came on the scene, or even while he was walking around, like certain expectations based on context of what they knew at the time, it could be humbling to think, like, we might have thought some of the same things. It might not have been as clearly obvious at certain points.
Exactly.
I suppose when he was in front of us, we look back today, looking back at scripture and being like, how did they not put it together? Like, it's so obvious.
And we give the disciples so much crap for, like, oh, I can't believe,
true,
Jesus being ever so gentle said, "Get behind me, Satan." And so we can sort of, to Peter, and we can mock Peter's like, how did Peter not get it? Well, we have the end of the story, right? They were living the story. And so to the degree that we see the apostles kind of blowing it and misunderstanding Jesus, this kind of book would sort of help explain why that is. Why wasn't it just immediately obvious that a humble son of a artisanal carpenter, or whatever you want to call his father, from Nazareth, who's doing very strange things like walking on water, like, why did they not just sort of like, oh yeah, obviously he's going to die and then be born again or be resurrected? Well, it's because that may not have necessarily been the script they were reading from. That wasn't sort of the air they were breathing per se, or they had misinterpreted things, whatever. So it sort of helps you understand. It puts you in their shoes, like you said, and say, oh, okay, I can see how this is maybe what they were expecting and why they were perhaps surprised.
Yeah, and kind of with that too. So with these texts, the translations, and you said you have commenters. What are you doing with the commentary on this? How, like, are you helping people read these texts or understand these texts or the nuances of the text? What's your goal with not just the translation, but how are you bringing us along these texts?
Part of the title speaks to both Jewish messianism and early Christology, and that's partly a nod towards this isn't just intended for a Christian readership. I have a neighbor across the street who's a very devout Jew, and I think he would benefit greatly from this book as well, because it's still sort of in his wheelhouse in terms of what did early Jews think about? It's the second question as to, okay, did they see Jesus as fitting that bill or not? But the commentary then is not designed for, what I'm intentionally not doing is taking a stand on a given passage.
Got it.
There's thousands of articles, and I put them in the footnotes, that do that. And they say, oh, this scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls suggests X about a Messiah figure, or this thing from a very trippy dude named Philo, this means X. I'm intentionally not doing that. Instead, what I'm simply trying to do with the commentary is, in essentially like 2 sentences or less, maybe sometimes 3, I'm simply trying to give the reader a feel for why this particular passage matters. Not necessarily what it means, but why you should care. Like, sort of, what role does it play? So it might say, okay, this scroll portrays 2 messiahs. There's a couple that do that. That's surprising to people. So there's a couple of scrolls that actually talk about 2 distinct messiahs, and they have some role to play in the future. And I kind of leave it at that. And then you read the text, like, wow, that's crazy. And I'm not trying to push you in any specific direction. What I'm simply trying to do is show you that there were competing views. I think a very common misconception, you hear it all the time, is people will say, oh, the Jews believed in the Messiah and that he would do X. I hear that all the time. And the sad thing is that's not really true, any more so than you can say, the Christians in the America think this one thing about this particular topic. Like, that's almost comical, because there's so much diversity and belief on a million different things, and getting worse. And so that's actually true in the ancient world as well. And it gives you a sense for the diversity of opinion, that they weren't all in agreement. There was a lot of different views, and that's exactly what you see in the Gospels. And that's exactly what you see in Acts. They weren't all on the same page as to who Jesus was. They had to kind of hammer that out. And so I think it's a misconception to think, oh, they all thought Jesus was fully God and man and was the Davidic king, but he was going to be the suffering servant. That's what God said he was going to be. But we are foolish people and don't always listen. And so there's actually, like, some people are kind of getting it wrong, or they got different ideas. They're not necessarily reading the Bible correctly. And so all that sort of mess is happening. And that's exactly where Jesus sort of plops down. He parachutes into that situation, and people start misunderstanding who he is and what his agenda is. And so the commentary doesn't take a stand. It's simply just trying to help you navigate why this particular fragment or whatever, how it contributes to the whole. So
yeah, so it helps a little bit mitigate against some false assumptions that I think we as Christians can make on what did they think back in the first century, versus there's a lot more nuance. Just like you said, there's a lot of nuance today.
Yeah, and we could potentially be making the same prematurely mistakes today on how we think his second coming is going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but also, I think one of the biggest hangups from the Pharisees on who Christ was is they had a really overconfident idea who Christ was going to be, right? And when he was in front of them, their hearts were closed to seeing him in front of them.
Yeah, well, in some respects, so were the disciples. They had hard-heartedness as well, and it's also, the book doesn't just touch on Messiah passages, where the word is used. And so one of the most prominent parts in the New Testament where we get insight into who Jesus is the introduction to John's gospel, where he describes Jesus as, quote unquote, the word, or the logos. And this is often surprising to folks, but there are Jewish passages, mainly one particular author, but not necessarily limited to him. It's mostly one particular Jewish writer, where he talks about a logos who is a godlike thing, godlike being of some sort. And so, is John using that, or is he pushing back against that? What's he doing? You also have Paul called Jesus the wisdom of God. And so there's loads of passages in the Jewish corpus of writings that talk about the wisdom of God being someone who fashions creation or holds creation together. And like, well, that kind of sounds like the New Testament. And so is it relevant? Is it not? Is Paul sort of chewing on that, or is he sort of pushing against it? And so this is the kind of book where you can actually, one of the things we haven't mentioned is that the book sort of organizes all this information in a certain way. It tags various passages. So if you want to look at every single time wisdom is used, you can go and do that. Or every single time, the star of Israel from Numbers is used. Or every single time you have, the righteous branch as an example from Jeremiah, you can trace that stuff through. And so you can kind of follow themes throughout these as well. And so it really is the book that I wish I had whenever I started working on early Christology, because I was trying to do that on my own. And so that's actually how I came upon the idea. It's like, well, someone needs to do this. So,
yeah. And then my last question before we kind of move to a close would be, I mean, you saw there was probably some sort of vacuum or some sort of lack in the scholarship for why this book had to be written. So what would you see that hadn't been done on these primary texts, especially as it relates to Christ, that you wanted to not just mitigate, but that you wanted to introduce? And hey, I think we should be thinking about this or looking at these texts. And so why these texts specifically, and what vacuum were you trying to fill?
Yeah, there's a couple, I think, reasons why I wanted to do it. The first one is accessibility. If you read books on the person and work of Jesus, even sort of introductory ones, like the Crossway one I did, inevitably they're going to be quoting Old Testament passages. They're going to be quoting from various Jewish writings that talk about this kind of stuff. And even as a scholar with access to pretty decent library resources, it is very difficult to track this stuff down. Google can only get you so far. And I just found it incredibly annoying to I don't even know where to find, some guy, like some blog post quotes from something that I barely even know what that is. And I don't even know where to find that, because they just sort of say, oh, look it up in the Ezekiel, the tragedian, verse 88 or whatever. I'm like, I don't even know what that is. And so access was a big part of it. And so I'm trying to bring it all together in one place where you don't have, because actually I ended up using something like 250 other sources, like just to get the texts together. And they're expensive and they're hard to track down. I kept our librarian very busy. The second frustration that you find once you do track them down is that half of the battle, if not more, paging the G.I. Joes, is translation. And you'll have a word that one scholar will more than happily translate as Messiah. Another scholar will say, no, it's not a Messiah. It's just sort of generically an anointed person, but it's not a deliverer figure who's going to kick some butt. And unless you have the original source, you don't even know that they've made that decision. And some of the books that you can buy that sort of put chunks of this stuff together, they're not even consistent within themselves. And so one of the things I try to do is say, all right, I'm one translator with a bunch of editors, and I'm going to try to be as consistent as possible so that even in English, you can trace this stuff through, which you can't really do if you're comparing 250 different sources and translations. You just can't do that because every translator's got his own philosophy. Those are probably the two biggest, is okay, how can I make this accessible and how can I make it usable even in English where people can trace these themes and that kind of thing. And then I tried to I cast a very broad net. And by that, I mean, even if a passage is something that I personally don't think is super important Christologically, but if a lot of other people do, I include it in there. And indirectly, there's sort of a secret subset of theses that I had in the back of my mind. One of them would be, there's a whole vein of early studies of Jesus that make a big deal, as I mentioned, about this wisdom idea. That's the key to understanding who Jesus is. And I personally don't buy that at all, but that's a whole different thing. And so, but I still include 20 different passages that speak to it. But if you actually read each of those 20 passages, if you just sort of sit down for an hour and trace through that using the tags, I think you'll come to my conclusion, actually. And you're like, yeah, there's really not much to see here. But if you read some scholar just sort of filtering them his own way, he's trying to spin an argument. The other thing that's sort of the undercurrent is within, and this is actually pretty surprising, but within Jewish studies, there is a very big set of voices, prominent scholars, who would suggest that there is what we would call a messianic vacuum prior to the time of Jesus. And what they mean by that language is that really nobody was caring all that much about a Messiah coming. Just a few little smatterings. They were mostly focused on Torah and food laws and kosher stuff. And that's partly true, but if you read this compendium, what you'll see is that the messianic vacuum is completely nonsense. That doesn't mean that they all had the right idea of a Messiah, but they definitely were thinking about it. And so that is once Jesus comes on the scene, that's exactly where they go. Like, oh, wait a second, is he the one that we think he is? The whole messianic vacuum thing, I think, is nonsense. And so this book, that's not the thesis of the book. That's sort of my ulterior motive, is that if you put them all together, it's like, yeah, that doesn't really hold water. People had a lot of opinions and hot takes about a Messiah. And that's a better way to sort of get your feet wet in John chapter 1 than sort of thinking that the Christians just sort of made it all up. Out of nowhere. So
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and just I have two super specific questions, and you could rattle them off really short if you want, but it's just based on my own curiosity, and I'm not sure if this is addressed in your book or not, but it's just based on the topic. If we go, I'll just ask both of them and then let you go. First one would be, if we go put ourselves in late BC during this time period, right before Christ comes, would the most common expectation of who he is being more of like a warrior that's going to physically battle the Roman Empire and defeat them? And then my next question would be, does this book make any connection to maybe, and this might be really specific, Herod and how he had the firstborn children killed, and then that's when Joseph and Mary, pregnant Mary, escaped? It seems like Herod might be onto something, thinking the Messiah is coming.
Right. Well, I'll do the second one first. I'm not making a specific connection to Herod, mainly because somewhat ironically, I don't deal with the New Testament itself. That's actually intentional. The point is to sort of talk about everything behind the scenes when you get to the New Testament. That being said, whenever the Magi go visit Herod and they say, hey, we think a new king of Israel's been born. And he says, well, why do you think that? And they say, well, we saw his star when it was rising. And then Herod kind of panics and he gets his scribes together and he's like, well, what the heck are they talking about? Where is this dude going to be born? And they say Bethlehem. And then they go to read the Old Testament. The star passage is from Numbers. And then the born in Bethlehem thing is from Micah. Both of those are covered in the book. And in fact, the star idea was very common in Jewish writings. It might be, in some respects, the most common metaphor used for a king who's coming, that they expected this star oracle of Balaam, with his donkey. They expected a king to be announced with a star. And so that wasn't something that Matthew just made up. That was a very common way in which they described a coming king as you're going to see some sort of star-like thing. And so I do think that actually is relevant. That's why I think whenever the Magi say, yeah, we saw a star, that's why he freaks out. It's like, oh, wait a second, maybe they're onto something here. And so I do think, so it sort of indirectly connects to it. But in terms of the first question, I would say that the expectation that you're going to have a king who's a warrior, I think that is a common view. I don't think it's necessarily the common view, or it's not the only view. It's one of the views that was competing. It's hard to say which is most common because, unfortunately, it's impossible to take the sources that we have and do the math as to sort of, does this represent 60% of the population? And you have the same problem today, in terms of you might like covenant theology, or like some Reformed writer, but does that what percentage of American Christianity does that represent? It's like, I don't know. I don't even know how you do that. So we're still a pretty small piece of the puzzle, but yeah, so I think it's like that. I think that is a very common view. You do see it in the sources, but it's definitely not the only view. And in fact, not everyone even thought there would be a Messiah. In fact, many modern Jews actually don't necessarily expect a Messiah. And so there's actually a pretty strong non-Messiah group within the Jewish world. And then you have others that are like, oh, we want a priest, or we want a king, or we want this or that. So a lot of it was up for grabs. So it's not just sort of William Wallace coming back that they were expecting. It was they had a variety of expectations. So
Okay.
but it's almost impossible to quantify, just because what we have that survived is very selective at the end of the day.
Yeah,
Sure.
and that's helpful, nuancing these things and providing the primary text so people can look through this themselves with the translation, with your help, and say, okay, what were they thinking previous to Jesus, and how does that help us understand, and not just say like, oh, you're terrible because you didn't think the same thing we did, but understand their context as it relates to the New Testament and the expectations around that as well. So hopefully it's a help to a lot of people, scholars, lay people, those interested in Jesus. There's a lot of people interested in Jesus, so that's a good thing. So yeah, I'm hoping people pick this up and understand for themselves, and allow this to help guide some of their understandings of the Bible and who Christ is and what he came to be, and how we can understand culturally and contextually as well as today. So thanks for writing this. Thanks for pulling these together for us. And
yeah,
I know
it was a long process.
Yeah, it was a long process, and you did it. So I think you provided a church with a great resource, and hopefully we can use this for further purposes.
I appreciate that.
So yeah, thanks for coming on, Dr. Lanier. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can talk to you again soon.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.